seconds. Now you are.
Okay, fantastic. So yes, thank you again. The truth of the matter is one of the unique pleasures that of many that I've had in giving this series here at BRS is that I've actually had several of my former YU students who now are members of this community, all grown up, who have been attending, whether live or via the live stream, as sort of a refresher course to, and every once in a while, I'll remind them or ask them to quiz them, see what they actually did remember or didn't. But it's been a great pleasure, sort of coming full circle with some of those students. And those of you, and they may be on our live stream this evening, who were my students back in YU may remember that when I would talk about neo-orthodoxy, I would often begin my lectures with this question. If Rav Hirsch were alive today, where would he be? If Rav Hirsch were alive today, where would he be? Now, that's a fun question to ask in Boca Raton, Florida, but it's even more fun to ask when you're standing or lecturing in Washington Heights, New York. Because really what I was asking is, what side of Washington Heights would Rav Hirsch belong in were he alive today? That is, would he find his home on the western side of Washington Heights, in the community that has a school that bears his name, the Yeshivas Shamson Raphael Hirsch, what is known today as the Breuers community, or would he find his home on the east side of Washington Heights in the institution known as Yeshiva University, one being a community created by direct descendants of Rav Hirsch, the other a community created around the motto of Torah Umada, clearly a derivative of the motto of Rav Hirsch of Torah in Derech Eretz. So which one would it be? And then, of course, I'm quick to tell them that we're in a history class and I am supposed to be a historian, and no historian worth their salt would ever ask that question, because it's impossible to answer. It's hard enough to understand a person in their own historical context. That's the best we can try and do as a historian. Right? But the question of where would a historical figure be if they were alive today, I mean, that's a nice conversation for Kiddush, right? Or for a Shabbos table, but that's not a question that a historian, any serious historian, could actually try and answer. But the truth of the matter is that the question, while it is unanswerable, does help highlight the fact that today, Rav Hirsch's legacy, like that of many great leaders of old, is really torn in two rather different directions. So back in 2005, Yated Ne'eman read a story about Rav Wolbe's attitudes to Torah and Torah in Derech Eretz. And there they quote Rav Wolbe, who we in this community are often hear our rabbis referencing, one of the great Baalei Musar of the 20th century. And here in this article they write that the view in the of the Gaon Tzaddik of Shamson Raphael Hirsch, that's all, concerning Torah in Derech Eretz, was understood by the Gedolei Yisrael, whose pronouncements are our authority in life, to be solely a matter of Horas Sha'a, right? That Rav Hirsch's understanding that one should and could engage in the world around us, in Western culture, in secular literature and secular learning, was Horas Sha'a. It was intended for a very specific point in time because of a certain set of circumstances. It was an emergency proclamation that was never intended to be carried out into future generations. Now, the source for this comes from, it's actually still in the end of Kiddushin, not in the Hakdama, but the end of Kiddushin, in the Birkas Shmuel, by Rav Baruch Ber Leibovitz, from the great Rosh Yeshiva, the early 20th century, the turn of the 20th century. And there the Birkas Shmuel writes that Ilam ha'emes al pi Torah mechuyev kol rav lahagid ki chas v'shalom lomar shahaya al pi Torah kadosha sheyitnu Yisrael b'neihem l'gymnasium. Right? One has to, every rabbi has to say clearly that chas v'shalom, that the Torah ever gave permission or license for Jews to send their children to a gymnasia, to a school, a secular school of secular learning. V'rak she'agon HaTzadik Rav Shamshon Raphael Hirsch Zatzal Asa zos mipnei shehu ra'a kol kach es ra'al hapitzui shel ha'haskala boer v'haisa bevadai kavanas HaTzadik she'al yidizei yashuvu l'tshuva shlema v'henshech hazman ksheyitz'amu tama shel haTorah v'yavinu mipian me'atzmam, right? L'shanos es ha'esek ha'chachmas ha'chitzonios right? Says the Berich HaShmuel, it's clear that, referring specifically to Rabbi Shamshon Raphael Hirsch, that he never uses the term, by the way, Horasha. The Berich HaShmuel never uses that term. Right? But what he's saying is, there's no question in his mind, right, that he intended for those Jews, right, to eventually give up this need to go to gymnasios, to give up the need for secular studies, once they tasted the true wisdom and depth of Torah HaKadosh. So we have a view of Rav Hirsch that secular learning was something he may have given temporary permission for, but certainly was not something that he thought people should be engaging in. It certainly was not a lachatchila, something which was a good thing, right, in the best of circumstances, to be engaging in. And then, I believe we have this book right here, if anybody wants to see it, but for $22.39, you can buy the ArtScroll biography of Rabbi Samson Raphael Hirsch, and there you will learn that his philosophy of Torah in Derech Eretz is an insistence that the Torah continues to provide the guide to every aspect of life, even after the fall of the ghetto walls. That's what Torah in Derech Eretz is. Now, some people might say that sounds like Torah in Torah, right? But that's a view of what Torah in Derech Eretz was, right? And what was it that Rav Hirsch was known for? Armed only with the force of his personality and eloquence of his pen, Rabbi Hirsch almost single-handedly arrested 50 years of unbroken ascendancy of reform in Germany. And he spent his life fighting the reform movement and pressing for this idea, right, that the totality of life ought to be governed by Torah and Torah alone. So we ought to understand, right, why there is a pull in one direction, or at least we see a pull in one direction for the legacy of Rav Hirsch. At the same time, though, if you were walking down Bennett Avenue in 1950, you may have noticed this sign. Go. A sign looking to raise funds for the building of Yeshivas Shamshon Raphael Hirsch and the shul along with it. A sign that unabashedly calls this place a modern school and a modern shul. Seemingly proud of its standing as something different than what had been traditionally done. And indeed, Rabbi Dr. Norman Lamb, who literally wrote the book on Torah Umada, and who, by the way, lived in the Breuer section of Washingtonites, wrote in the book called Torah Umada, in his preface, he notes that while other major luminaries will be mentioned in this book, Rabbi Samson Raphael Hirsch is so directly connected to the idea of Torah Umada, he deserves a chapter into and of himself. The 19th and 20th century saw renewed attempts at introducing Torah Umada, both conceptually and institutionally, that is Torah and science, Torah and secular study, into the Ashkenazi Jewish life in both Central and Eastern Europe, because the efforts of Rabbi Samson Raphael Hirsch were so extensive and consequential, we accord them separate treatment in following chapters, instead proceed here with a brief sketch of such ventures in Russia and Lithuania. Earlier, Rabbi Lamb, in an earlier writing, Rabbi Lamb literally wrote that for the latter term, we can just as well substitute the Hirschian Derech Eretz, Torah Umada, Torah in Derech Eretz, the same thing, says Rabbi Lamb. The ideas of Rav Hirsch are the ideas of Yeshiva University, college education, liberal arts together with Torah, valuing the world of general studies and Western culture side by side, a synthesis together with the studying of Torah and Talmud and And Chazal, that, says Rabbi Lamb, is the legacy of Rabbi Hirsch. YU is the home, the spiritual heir, the spiritual legacy of Rav Hirsch. Two very different conceptions. In order to understand how that comes to be, we need to go back in time and go back and understand the life of Rav Hirsch, the world into which he came, and the communities in the world which he ultimately built. But first, we are going to play a little game. The game is, can you give the rest of my lecture? What do I mean? Well, here's how you play. I am going to give you one fact. And then I want to see how many people, based on that one fact, put on your historian's cap and process everything that we've been talking about for the last 2 weeks. With this one little fact, you're going to be able to give me the rest of, well, you're going to give me the rest of a lecture. Whether that's actually going to be my lecture or not remains to be seen. But I want you here, based on this one little fact, I want you to tell me, aha, this is what he's about to say. Here we go. The birth and place, birth year and place of Rabbi Samson Raphael Hirsch.
The Hamburg Temple.
Ah. Tell me. I hear mumbling. Somebody call it out. Why is this significant? The year and the place. Why is that significant?
The Hamburg Temple. That's when they started the Reform movement.
Okay, the whole story starts in Hamburg, right? When? Does anybody remember?
1820.
Okay, 1800. That's good.
1820.
Up close. Okay, very, very close. Right? So first of all, we realize that his life belongs in this, right? In this crucible. That's the entire life. Reverse. Right? Yes, he's born in 1808, so 10 years earlier. Right? But this is the span of Rav Hirsch's life. And he lives here in Hamburg where that whole story happens. Right? And this was the story. Right? The story of the Hamburg Temple controversy, which begins in 1817 with this document that comes out outlining this new temple that was going to be built, that was going to create this restoration, of public worship to its deserving dignity, a well-ordered ritual, right, that was going to be done in German with a choir, right, and the accompaniment of an organ. Ultimately, we said, though, but pushing boundaries that hadn't been pushed before, arguing that certain parts of davening should be said in German, that references to the building of the Beis Hamikdash should be removed from the liturgy, that an organ played by a non-Jew should happen on Shabbos and on Yom Tov. All of this was proposed in 1817. After that comes a response from the Hamburg Beis Din. After that comes the reformers seeking halachic justification for what they're doing. After that, in 1819, comes the publication of this work, Eila Divrei Habris, which brought together the great minds of the Gedolim of Western and Central Europe, all in an effort to fight against what is happening in Hamburg. Rav Hirsch is how old? This is 1819. He's 11 years old. By a show of hands, how many people have or had an 11-year-old at home? Actually, have one right now. Does an 11-year-old know what's going on? Do they listen to the conversation at the table? Are they old enough to process? Oh, they sure are. So little Rav Hirsch, I don't think they called him that, right? But little Rav Hirsch is sitting there at his Shabbos table as the conversation every Shabbos is raging around these reformers. Rav Hirsch's grandfather is Mendel Frankfurter, who was a major player in the Hamburg community. There is no doubt that this was the conversation at the Shabbos table over Rav Hirsch for years. And this is the environment in which he grows up. But there's more. There's more of this. We have so far told the story of how this reform movement, early reform movement, in Germany begins to respond to the realities of modernity, post-French Enlightenment. we have told the story of how a group of traditional rabbis go from being almost traditional to traditionalist, but we note that the geography in which this happens is largely first centered around Pressburg, today Bratislava, under the leadership of the Chassam Sofer. That's until Chassam Sofer's death in 1839, and then many of his students will move out on the eastward, right, towards the Carpathian Mountains, and that's where that sort of next generation, the more radical form of so many of those teachings will begin to emerge, particularly in 1865 with the Psak Din and Michalovcha. What we haven't said at all yet is what happens in the traditional communities of Germany. What is happening? How are they responding? The aftermath of the Hamburg Temple controversy.
You know, in that sense, Hamburg for Germany is like New York in the sense that it's an outlet to the world. And that time, Germany was a lot of little state love that didn't get along so much together. Hamburg, though, was a much more cosmopolitan place.
And it was, and as we'll see, it's going to play a central role. Right? Hamburg is going to play a central role not just in the reform movement, but in creating what's going to become, right, German Orthodoxy as well. So, how does traditional German community respond? The truth of the matter is that if there were one person who we could call more than anybody else the father of neo-Orthodoxy, modern Orthodoxy, it would be a name that is absolutely not a household name in Jewish communities today. Even people of great learning generally will raise an eyebrow when you tell them that one of the most influential people in the history of Orthodoxy is a man by the name of Rabbi Avraham Bing. Bing? Who's that? Never heard of him, right? Never heard of him. You have somebody in the back. Alex is throwing this right?
It was ready.
So the challenge of Rabbi Bing is that he didn't leave us any spark. And unfortunately, there are many great Talmidei Chachamim of old who simply didn't leave us any spark, and so we don't know that all that much about them. Their legacy and their influence becomes limited without a written monument that outlasts them. So Rabbi Bing is one of those people. But what we do know is we have his Talmidim who have written about him. And we have Hespedim that were given at his death. And they are unbelievable. And they all point to something very similar. So what we know about Rabbi Bing is that we can't see this at all. That says Würzburg. He was the Av based in a German town called Würzburg. And we know that he had many students, but he had several students who will become the pillars of neo-Orthodoxy, both in Germany actually and in England as well. And we also know that his students, those that we know, those who go on to positions of prominence, all are deeply secular educated in addition to their rabbinic learning. So the three most prominent of them that we know of, there's a man by the name of Rabbi Isaac Bernays, Chacham Yitzchak Bernays, Rabbi Yaakov Ettlinger, often known by his Sefer Aruch LaNer, and Rabbi Nathan Marcus Adler, who will go on to become the first chief rabbi of the British Empire, ushering in a legacy there of truly noble Jewish leaders as heads of the British rabbi.
These are all Orthodox rabbis.
Oral Orthodox rabbis.
So why are they dressed like this?
Excellent question. We'll get to the dress in just a minute. Okay. Let's start with Isaac Bernays. Isaac Bernays comes to study with Rabbi Bing in Würzburg, in this small yeshiva that he had in Würzburg. And he goes from Würzburg in 1821. He is chosen to become the rabbi of Hamburg. That is an opening, a vacancy opens up right in the aftermath of the Hamburg Temple controversy. And the man that the traditional community in Hamburg chooses to be their next Rav is a man who I was just asked whether he is Orthodox or not, based on the way he looks. Chacham Yitzchak Bernays. What do we know about Chacham Yitzchak Bernays? Wolf Holdenheim in 1821 went to hear Yitzchak Bernays give sermon and said as follows: "My friend, what you ask is difficult indeed. In order to properly assess Bernays, one must be Bernays. My limited judgment and meager knowledge do not suffice to measure his stature. He stands above and beyond our rabbis, masters of the written and oral Torah, above and beyond our philosophers and historians of antiquity. It is not appropriately concerning him a wise charmer. The moment he begins to discourse on Torah or wisdom, all become charmed and silent. Hearing him discuss Hebrew language and biblical exegesis, one believes he is listening to Ibn Ezra himself. If the discussion is about Mishnah, Talmud, Sifra, Sifrei, it is as if he has become Maimonides incarnate. In general knowledge, he is Plato incarnate." To say that again, in general knowledge, he is Plato incarnate. Regarding his character, he is pious, noble, and modest. Any community, large or small, that will have the good fortune to come under Bernays' leadership will not long remain isolated. It will become an ear of the aim be Israel, all the nations shall flow to. That's quite a haskell. So what do we know about him? He is charismatic, okay? Very well educated, both secularly and in Torah learning. Heinrich Heine was a Jew, German Jew, who converted to Christianity and goes on to become one of the great poets of the 19th century German. He also heard Chacham Bernays speak, and he described him, he's an ingenious man and has more spirit within him than Dr. Clay Solomon Auerbach, the first and the second noteworthy preachers and rabbis in the Hamburg Temple, the Reform Temple. He, Bernays, has more spirit in them than any of them, yet, he writes, none of the Jews understand him. Okay. Clearly, this was a man of exceptional learning. A man of exceptional learning who had a university background. And his training was in biblical exegesis. Right? He was a Tanakh scholar. He was a trained philosopher. He dressed in a way that certainly signified that he was a more modern rabbi. He is the one who insisted that they give him the title Chacham rather than rabbi, because it brought with it a certain sense of respect, honor that wasn't necessarily being accorded to rabbi in Hamburg at the time. This was the person that the traditional community in Hamburg decides to bring in the wake of the Hamburg Temple controversy. So what do they do? What's the strategy? How are they responding? And how does it differ than what's happening in central Austria and Hungary?
Compromise.
Compromise? Okay, maybe. How else might you describe it? Fighting fire with fire. Okay, we're going to do what they do, we're going to do it better. Right? Or at least we're going to do some of what they do, right? Perhaps not all. And where we can, right, we're going to do, we'll do it, right? We're gonna draw the line somewhere, but we're going to show them the things that were important to them, right? Secular learning, the ability to give a sermon in German, right? The ability to think, a philosopher. We can do all those things, right? And more. That's Chacham Bernays. Goes to learn with Rabin in Würzburg, becomes rabbi in Hamburg in 1821. But there's another important luminary of the Jewish world, right, who also studies with Rabin, also gets a secular university education. His name is Rabbi Yaakov Ettlinger. Rabbi Yaakov Ettlinger is easily the last of the Western European Gedolim who is still able to bridge the world into Eastern Europe, into the world of the yeshivos, had the learning and the respect, right, that those coming from the world of Lita, the world of the yeshivos of the East, would look up to and respect. Rabbi Yaakov Ettlinger studies with Rabin in Würzburg, and then he goes on to this town of Mannheim, where he runs his own class. It was known in Germany as a Klaus, and in Yiddish a Klois, a small yeshiva. After running that yeshiva for a little while, he is invited to become the rabbi and create his own yeshiva, or head the yeshiva, in what was then a city known as Alton. Today, if you would go to a city of Hamburg, you would find a neighborhood in Hamburg called Altona Altstadt. It's the old city of Alton. Today, it's one city. They are literally right next to each other. Then there were two cities, actually two countries. Altona was part of Denmark at the time, right? But there was free passage between the two. They were literally sister cities sitting on two sides, right, of a river that went through them. So by the time you get to 1836, you have both students of Rav Bing, both in the same, pretty much the same city, one in Altona, one in Hamburg, right? That becomes now the center for Jewish learning in Western Europe. Both of them already before Rav Hirsch shows up on the scene. University trained, secularly educated. So what's Rav Hirsch? So Rav Hirsch comes onto the scene in 1808, born in 1808 in Hamburg. I said a moment ago, Chacham Bernays becomes the rabbi in what year? Anybody remember? 1821, which would make Rav Hirsch how old? So who is presiding over the bar mitzvah of young Rabbi Hirsch? Chacham Isaac Bernays. Who is the man that Rav Hirsch sits in shul and listens to Shabbos after Shabbos, give drushos that involve, that sounds like Plato incarnate? Chacham Bernays. That's the shul he's growing up in. And I can assure you, Heinrich Heine aside, there was at least one little kid in that shul who understood, right, what Chacham Bernays would say. I know that Rav Hirsch did, because he talks about the influence of Rav Bing, right, later on in life. Sorry, of Chacham Bernays later on in life. So that's where he grows up. He grows up listening to the sermons of Chacham Bernays. But then he will leave Hamburg to go and study in the yeshiva in Mannheim. Who is the head of the yeshiva in Mannheim? Well, Yaakov Ettlinger. The two primary influences on Rav Hirsch are the two primary students of Rav Bing, both of whom were secularly educated. One whose focus was far more on the world of philosophy and Tanakh. The other whose focus was much more in the world of Gemara and Halacha. These were the two influences on Rav Hirsch as a young man. Now, Rav Hirsch does not stay in yeshiva for very long. He's only there for a year. He then goes to university in the city of Bonn. He's only there for a year also. That, by the way, is the totality of Rav Hirsch's formal learning. 1 year in yeshiva, 1 year in university. Does not have a degree. Because early on, his abilities are widely recognized. He immediately gets a position as a pulpit rabbi, ultimately landing up in the Austro-Hungarian Empire, in the city of Nikolsburg, and works his way up to becoming the rabbi, the chief rabbi of Moravia, this entire region. That was his position, Rav Hirsch, in the late 1840s. It is a position that he will ultimately abandon in 1851 in order to come back to a tiny little community in the city of Prague. More on that in just a minute. Rav Hirsch, though, is not the only person deeply influenced by both Chacham Isaac Bernays and Rav Yaakov Ettlinger. A few years younger than Rav Hirsch, but pretty much following a very interestingly parallel life, is a man by the name of Rabbi Yisrael Hildesheimer. Rav Hildesheimer is born in the city of Halberstadt in 1820, so he's 12 years younger. He's a little younger. He will go, though, to study in Alton. With who? Yaakov Ettlinger at that point is the Rosh Yeshiva in Alton. Everybody following me here? Right? So now we have the Yisrael Hildesheimer. He goes to Altona to study with Rav Ettlinger, who is now the Rosh Yeshiva there. And he writes in his hesped for Rav Bing, for Chacham Bernais, that when he was a yeshiva student in Altna, he would go across the river for Shabbos to listen to the drushos of Chacham Bernais. So he too is being influenced by both of these students of Rav Bing, learning in the yeshiva of Rav Yaakov Ettlinger, listening to the drushos of Chacham Bernais. Rav Israel Hildesheimer will also leave Altona and ultimately become a pulpit rabbi also in the Austro-Hungarian Empire, this time in the city of Eisenstadt in 1851. And curiously enough, he will also leave, not finding very friendly territory in the hospitable territory in the Austro-Hungarian Empire, ultimately leaving and taking a position in the city of Berlin. So that by the time we get to the 1860s, you have two students of these two students of Rav Bing who have ascended the pulpit in these two cities, now Berlin and Frankfurt, which have now become the two new centers of German Orthodoxy and will remain so for the second half of the 19th century. So what do these communities look like when Rav Hirsch and Rav Hildesheimer come back to the world of Germany, German Orthodoxy, by the mid-19th century? Well, as was already pointed out, we might look no further than the dress of these rabbis, two of whom here are of the older generation. This is Rav Yaakov Ettlinger. This is Chacham Bernais. This is Rav Hirsch. What do you notice? Okay, so you're pointing to the color, the canonicals here, right? Not something you would typically see at an Eastern European Rav. Anything else?
Rav Bernais did the exact opposite. They had white and black. With their black and white.
They would do white and black and white.
Purposely.
Yeah. Anything else? Okay, the head covering, the hats, right? The beard is okay, right? Good, excellent. Right? So in case this wasn't sufficiently clear, this is a picture of several Protestant theologians from about the same period. This is a series of pictures of Central and Eastern European rabbis from the same period. And so the question is, do these rabbis, who do they greater resemble? The rabbis of their period? The Netziv, Yisrael Chanan, this is the son of Chassam Sofer, or the Protestant clergy of their time? And the answer is pretty strikingly clear. Sorry? Well, but the point here, right, is that when the Reformed clergy were beginning to dress like this, that actually wasn't much of an innovation at all. Because the traditional rabbis of their world were already dressing like this in the beginning of the 19th century. They had already begun to adopt these customs of the world around them. This was dressing like this was not an innovation of Hirsch. His teachers dressed that way too. His teachers were already secularly trained. They already had the shorter beards. They were already giving their sermons in German. He did not bring any of that into the shul for the first time. It was already there. And in fact, when Rav Hirsch writes his first book in 1836, the 19 Letters of Uziah, this book he tries to capture. He's only 28 years old at the time. He tries to capture the sentiments of the time. He's writing for the youth, for the students, for the young people of his day. And he does it, if you're familiar with the work, right? He creates a fictional young person, right, called Benjamin, who is writing these letters to his rabbi, Naftali, and asking him these questions, and the rabbi responds with the incredible eloquence, right? And that is, if you've never read the 19 Letters of Ben Uziel, you should read it. But listen to the question that's being asked. And the question is, thus I've always wondered more than a little how you, who know how to appreciate the beauties of Virgil, Tasso, and Shakespeare, this is student talking to rabbi. Rabbi, you, who knows how to appreciate the beauties of Virgil, Tasso, and Shakespeare, and can fathom the logical edifices of Leibniz and Kant, How can you find pleasure in the formless, tasteless writings of the Old Testament or in the illogical disputations of the Talmud? This is where the young people are already in 1836. So there are rabbis who already are known to be conversant in Shakespeare, and young people who already in the traditional community are asking, why bother with Judaism anymore? How do you balance, how do you justify your modern sensibility, your secular learning with this antiquated stuff called Judaism? Sometimes our mechanchim in our high schools today think that this is new. When our young people struggle with this, and then you open up the writings of our first, it's amazing to see how they were struggling with the same thing 200 years ago. But that's where the young people were. That's where the community was already in 1836. This is Rav Hirsch. Says Rav Hirsch, and as for the religious training of the young, which should be the bearer of all our hopes for the future, how does it fit? Meaning, what do our schools look like today, the 1830s, the 1840s in Germany? Our religious schools are like all other institutions of learning of the present day. Our young people are made thoroughly capable of contending vigorously in the struggle for a livelihood. The trades, commerce, the arts and sciences, all of these are carefully inculcated in the mind, developed, although even in this regard, more attention is paid to the mere training of the memory than to the cultivation of habits of thought. Still a problem very much today. But let's just pause there again and see what Rav Hirsch just said. What is the reality of our schools today in the traditional Orthodox communities of Germany in the 1830s and 1840s? What is true about them? Secular education is excellent. It's a given. It's not a question. It's a given. We're doing a great job, right? Well, we're relying too much on memory. We should teach them to think a little bit, right? But beyond that, trades, commerce, the arts and sciences, these are carefully inculcated and the mind's developed. But what about the education of the heart? The cultivation of Judaism? Where's the schoolism imbued with the Jewish spirit, so that the spirit may also inspire the life of its students? What about the rearing of human beings who will see themselves as creatures living in a divine world and endowed with powers belonging to God, which they are to dedicate to the fulfillment of God's will? Where are the young men and women who will rejoice in their mission, who will be imbued with a fiery love for the name Jew, which summons them to such a way of life, to fulfill the divine law amidst perils, sufferings, and privations, who comprehend the world, the past, the present, and themselves as cornerstones in the edifice of the future? You've never read Rav Hirsch before. And from what I understand, if you heard him in German, he was even more powerful. But you get at least a small taste here, right, of what a powerful orator he is, right, of his way with words and the way he has of inspiring, right, and touching the hearts of those who read him, and more so even those who listen to him. So what is this community that he's coming to? It's a community where you have young people who are already struggling, you have rabbis who are already well educated, you have schools where the question is not, should we teach secular studies? It's, where's the Judaism in our schools? And that is certainly borne out in the letter that Rav Hirsch writes. It's published in the preface to his next book, the book called Chorev. It gets learned less so than the 19 letters does. Chorev is it's almost a work of halacha. It goes through the various mitzvos of the Torah and gives an explanation for why we do that. And tries to give kind of the inner philosophy, the inner ideas behind the mitzvos of the Torah. And in this letter that he writes to his friend, a certain Z.H. May, right, in describing why he wrote this book, he writes as follows. We'll just read the underlying pieces. Among Jews, he writes, however, nothing is less well known than Judaism itself. As it is, however, I see an older generation in which Judaism has become an inherited mummy. A generation which shows veneration for Judaism, is true, but a veneration without spirit. Some of that generation, therefore, see only tombstone inscriptions in Judaism and thus despair of the eternal validity of the only thing that makes life worth living. They only see tombstone inscriptions in Judaism. That's all it is. On the other hand, I see a younger generation aglow with noble enthusiasm for Judaism, or rather for Jews. These young men do not know authentic Judaism, and what they believe they know of it, however, they consider an empty form without meaning. I see no one in our day capable of disclosing to the young generation the meaning behind what they wrongly consider as empty forms, of reviving the mummy, and of taking our young generation to a vantage point which they can behold the shining light of Judaism. Therefore, he says, I am writing this book. Because our young people need it. Because somebody needs to revive the mummy. Because if we let it go as it's going, Judaism will be dead, says Rav Hirsch. With this background, with this understanding of where the community was at the time that Rav Hirsch returns in 1850, this is already earlier, 1830s, we can now return to this motto of Yafet Torah in Derech Eretz. This tagline of Rav Hirsch and his community, which was indeed the tagline, and perhaps understand it a little better. Let me ask you the following question. Yafet Torah in Derech Eretz. How great is Torah with Derech Eretz, general culture, study of the world? In the 1830s in German, which of those two was the Chidush? Which was the innovation? When you're talking about Torah with Western culture, which was the innovation? Torah was the innovation. Now, is that the same as saying it was a Horas Shah? That it was only there that he gave permission to do these things for one generation and never intended them for doing things? No, that's not it at all. It wasn't a question. You didn't have to give permission for secular education. It was given that you had a secular education. That was part of how Jews lived in that world. It was never questioned. He had a secular education. His rabbis before him had a secular education. That was a given. What he was trying to do was tell them, Yafet Torah in Derech Eretz. Right? There's something beautiful about joining Torah together with your Derech Eretz, that this can still be revived, that there's reason to continue to practice and continue to believe. That was the message of Rav Hirsch. If we were to compare, perhaps, side by side, the CVs of Rabbi Hirsch and Rabbi Hildesheimer, what would emerge is the following: two giants of German Orthodoxy, both of whom play a critical role in its time, in the 19th century, and for what is to come thereafter. So Rabbi Hirsch, we may best call him, or refer to him as a master orator, a biblical exegete. He was a commentator, right, writes on all of Chumash, right, on Tehillim, an essayist, a theologian. His collected writings, right, are works of philosophy and theology. He is not a Talmudist in the traditional sense. And he is not, yes, we have some tshuvos of Rav Hirsch, but they're not traditional tshuvos. Halacha, Gemara, that he knew it, he absolutely knew it. But that wasn't his forte. That isn't where he spent most of his time and his energy, because quite honestly, it's not what his people needed. It's not what his community, it's not where they were. Right? When you had young people who were asking, like, why are you bothering? Right? A lengthy tshuva, right, on the importance, the halachic ramifications of Talmud Torah isn't the right response. Right? But a philosophical and theological essay on why it's beautiful to continue to engage with this, that is what it was called for, and that's what Rav Hirsch did. So his life story goes like this. He studies for a year in Rav Yaakov Ettlinger at Mannheim, right? Then he goes to the University of Bonn. For 15 years, he's the rabbi of these two cities, Oldenburg and Emden. That's where he publishes first his 19 letters of Ben Uziel. Right? In 1837, he publishes that work, Chorei, that we spoke about a moment ago. In 1846, he becomes the rabbi of Nikolsburg and the chief rabbi of Moravia. As we mentioned before, right, this doesn't last that long. He will, when he is there, right, he will fight for the emancipation of Austro-Hungarian Jews, that is for full-fledged citizenship, for Austro-Hungarian Jewry, but it ultimately doesn't get him very far. And where it does get him is deeply criticized by both the right and the left, by those who want to make more reforms, which he was resistant to, and those who felt the kinds of things he was willing to give in on or went too far, but he found himself attacked from both sides. And it's largely for that reason that what his vision for an orthodoxy sort of guided by the Chacham Bernais and Rav Yaakov Ettlinger, that sort of synthesis of those two, didn't find friendly ground in the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And so in 1851, when the small community of Frankfurt comes to him and appeals to him to come be their rabbi, right, he agrees. And what was this community? This was what we would call a secessionist community. What do we mean by that? I mentioned in previous lectures that in this time, shuls, you couldn't just go and start your own shul. Right? A shul had to have the approval of the government. It was funded through taxes on the community and ultimately went through a government office that went back to fund, right, the communal institutions. At a certain point, by the mid-19th century, there was a problem emerging in many German communities, which was that most of the community at a certain point had decided that they were more in favor of the reform-minded shuls, the reform-minded rabbis. And that's the kind of shul that they wanted to have. Now, if you are living in that community at the time and your feelings, your allegiances are more to a traditional community, you find yourself in a difficult spot because there's one shul, right? There's one rabbi, and that's a rabbi that you're not comfortable with. And so they begin to plead, right, for permission, petition for permission to create a separate shul that would have a traditional rabbi at its helm. And they were, in the community of Frankfurt, they were given that permission. They created a shul, they called it Kahal Adas Yishurim, and they invited Rabbi Hirsch to come and be its rabbi. When he comes in 1851, so he starts actually 3 different schools, right? A primary school, an elementary school, a vocational high school, and a high school for girls, right, that had both Judaic and secular studies in it. He found a journal, scholarly journal known as Yeshurim. He writes his commentaries on Chumash, Tehillim, and the Siddur. And this, though, is probably what takes up the vast majority of his time. Right? And that is the fight for what is known as Ausdruckgemeinde, and basically what it means is as follows. You come to this community, the secessionist shul. So they successfully petitioned to have their own shul. But the problem is, you're still paying taxes to the community. A secessionist shul does not get funded by the communal dollars, the communal tax. You pay that out of pocket. So if you are a member of that traditional shul, you are paying your dues to that shul to pay the salary of somebody like Rav Hirsch and whatever other types of operating costs you have. And you are getting taxed to the community, and there your money is going to pay for the reform rabbi, the reform shul, the reform shechita, the reform whatever else might be happening in that community. And so Rav Hirsch takes up the fight initially only for tax relief, to say this isn't fair. We shouldn't have to pay into the taxes of the general community. We don't use the services of the general community. We have our own. We should be able to pay, only pay for those services that we use. The fight for tax reform or tax relief ultimately becomes a larger fight. It becomes a larger fight to say, well, actually, we need to break off from this community completely. We need a completely separate community. And in fact, we need a separate community because we don't recognize what they're doing as legitimate Judaism. And in order to make that fight, in order to make that argument, Rav Hirsch is going to have to use everything he's got to prove that what the reformers are doing is not part of Judaism. They are out. Right? Because the only way our community can survive financially, above all else, is if we can convince the powers that be that this other community is not part of us. We're different from them. Their religion is not our religion. So indeed, Rav Hirsch becomes an advocate. Right? I'm a disputer and ultimately advocate for separating orthodoxy from the Reform community. Interestingly enough, his fight for Austritt ultimately becomes a larger cross-denominational fight in Germany, where he gets allies from other Christian denominations who want something similar. And it actually ultimately leads to a full separation of church and state in what will ultimately become Germany. Rav Hildesheimer's story is a little bit different. Rav Hildesheimer, as we mentioned before, is a much more traditional Talmudic scholar, a halachist. He writes shuvos. He writes chidushim. Right? Although his training was an academic Bible study. His story goes like this. He learned for 3 years under Rav Etlinger in Altona. He is actually the first one to complete his degree, or first ever completes his degree. Right? Hildesheimer gets an undergraduate degree from the University of Berlin, and then gets a doctorate from the University of Halle-Wittenberg. In 1851, he's appointed rabbi of Eisenstadt, Hungary. While in Eisenstadt, he founds a school that also has both secular studies and Judaic studies. He founds a yeshiva that will include both Tanakh and the study of Hebrew in it. But the real events of his time in Hungary happened in 1864, when the Austro-Hungarian government puts out is testing the waters. They want to create a state-run rabbinic seminary. That is, they want to have more control over who their rabbis are, what the rabbis are telling the Jewish communities. And this had already been tried in Russia and didn't really work terribly well in the 1840s. And so the Austro-Hungarian Empire is going to try and do it also, create a state-run rabbinical seminary. Now, this creates quite a tumult amongst the rabbinic leadership of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. It is fiercely opposed by most of the rabbinic establishment, who wants the government involved in our training of rabbis and telling us what we can teach or what we can't. Rav Hildesheimer, however, sees a different side. He thinks that there's actually an opening and an avenue here to train more modern rabbis. Rabbis will have a sensibility that allows them to talk to the young people of their time. He fears what the government will do and the controls that they will try if they don't have this as an option. And so he will fight against the rabbinic establishment in Hungary for the creation of a state-sponsored rabbinical seminary. Now, what year are we in? 1864. And where are we? No, we're not in Germany. We're in Hungary. What happens in 1865 in Hungary? Remember that? This Psak Din of Michalovce? This, we noted last time, was the moment, was the birth of ultra-Orthodoxy, was these pronouncements, right, that prohibited to give a drasha in the language of the nation. Right? It's prohibited to enter for the purpose of prayer into a shul which didn't have a bima in the middle. It's prohibited to enter a shul with a tower. It's prohibited to make a mechitza which separates men from women, which doesn't completely preclude the men from seeing the women. It is prohibited to listen to the tefillos of a choir. It ain't for a Jew to pray with them or to answer amen after them, even if he's therefore forced to pray alone, right? And it's Yahari V'al Yador. Right? And we asked ourselves at the end of that lecture, we said, 1865, why is it worrying about things like changing where the bima is and davening with a choir in 1865? The Reform movement by that point is already broken with halacha completely. And what did we answer?
Fighting against it.
A Deutsch, right, in that postcard, it wasn't a reformer. Who is it?
Modern Orthodox.
It's Rav Hildesheimer, right? It's what Hildesheimer represents. It's the German Orthodoxy who had made its way into Hungary at the time, who was trying to get a foothold in Hungary, create a state-sponsored rabbinic seminary in Hungary, and the rabbinic establishment rallies against that and pushes them out. No, usser, and usser. Not what the Reform movement is doing. What the German Orthodox are trying to do. We can't go there, because if we go there, we're going to land up in just a few years, right? Completely outside. It's a slippery slope. Step on it and you're finished. You're going to be outside the world of Judaism. Time to circle the wagons. Time to gird the loins. Right? Time to battle the Melchanes Hashem. Right? And say no. It's absolutely usher. It's absolutely forbidden. So Rav Hildesheimer does not find fertile soil in Western Europe. In Hungary. Sorry about that. So instead, when this doesn't work in 1864, it's no surprise that in 1869 he moves back to Germany, to the community of Berlin, who had also created a secessionist shul. They called theirs Kal Adas Yisrael. It was Kal Adas Yeshurim in Frankfurt, Kal Adas Yisrael in Berlin. And one of the first things that he does is he creates a rabbinical seminary, very much along the lines of what he envisioned in Hungary, to create new modern rabbis. That becomes known as the Hildesheimer Rabbinical Seminary in Berlin. So the story of German Orthodoxy then is the story of two great individuals who have a similar background in that both of them studied under both Chacham Bernays and Rav Yaakov Ettlinger, both of whom were Talmidim Rav Avram Bing. They take a similar journey that both of them land up for a short time in the Austro-Hungarian Empire and are not successful there, because the communities are receptive to their vision of what the orthodoxy of the 19th century is and ought to look like, and ultimately make their way back, one to Frankfurt and one to Berlin. Their stories thereafter where Hirsch builds a flourishing community. In Berlin, his shuls take off, and a community that started as a handful of Orthodox families in the 1850s becomes several hundred families by the 1880s by his death. He hands the reins of his community over to his son-in-law, Rabbi Shlomo Breuer, and ultimately hands it over to Dr. Joseph Breuer, who will ultimately bring the community over to the shores of New York City. It's Rav Hildesheimer who establishes the place of learning, right? The rabbinical seminary of German Orthodoxy. He will be succeeded at the helm of the Hildesheimer Rabbinical Seminary by Rav David Zvi Hoffman, who is actually an Eastern European Jew who comes over, right, but is taken by the world of German Orthodoxy, blends the two together in a very fascinating way, becomes easily the posek of German Orthodoxy in the 20th century, and then hands things over. And also I should say, Rav David Zvi Hoffman, right, takes over for Rav Israel Hildesheimer, and he is, in addition to being a great posek, also a great Chumash scholar, a scholar of Torah Shebechtav, and he ultimately, right, will hand things over to Rabbi Chia Yaakov Weinberg, who comes from Eastern Europe, and who will blend these two, known by his shuvos, right, the Sridei Ish. That is what happens in Germany over the course of the 19th century. It may not surprise you, then, to hear Rabbi Rakefet's biography of Rav Soloveitchik, great architect of modern Orthodoxy, or Torah Mada, in Yeshiva University. And he writes as follows: a contemporary thus describes his memories of a frequent Berlin street scene during this period. In those years, talking about Berlin, one could frequently encounter three men walking along the streets of Berlin who stood out even amongst Berlin's Jewry, which was certainly not short of eminent personalities. The three men were Joseph Dov Soloveitchik with Professor Eugene Mittwoch, and an Orthodox Jew and distinguished Orientalist, and with Rabbi Chaim Heller, one of the great scholars of the time, sometimes accompanied by Rabbi Dr. Yechiel Yaakov Weinberg, rector of the Hildesheimer Rabbinical Seminary. So, while much of the focus of German Orthodoxy often is here, to the world of Frankfurt and the world of Rav Hirsch, there's something else happening here in the 19th century, which only grows in the 20th century, where Berlin becomes a destination for great Jewish minds, where the University of Berlin becomes a destination for great traditional Torah scholars who also want to pursue a university education like Rabbi Joseph B. Soloveitchik, And so we find that this tradition of Rav Hildesheimer to Rav Tzvi Hoffman, to Yechiel Yaakov Weinberg, will ultimately meet Yechiel Yaakov Weinberg walking together on the streets of Berlin, Rabbi Yosef Dov Soloveitchik. Those two worlds will ultimately come together, and Rabbi Yosef Dov Soloveitchik will be influenced by the Hildesheimer strain of German Orthodoxy, of a rabbinical seminary that takes the brightest young yeshiva learners and takes them and trains them in a modern way with secular education and secular studies. That will have quite an impact on the young Rabbi Yosef Dov Halevi Soloveitchik. And so if we come back to where we started, and we can begin to understand that, yes, it is certainly true that Rav Hirsch and his vision of Torah in Derech Eretz, it is not Horas Shah. It was not permission he gave for a particular moment in time. It was absolutely an acceptance of a reality that secular learning in Western culture is part of who we are. As modern Jews in the modern world, his goal again was Yafet Torah in Derech Eretz. But because that was the case, because so much of what he was about was to bring Torah to this community, and was also to fight against the validity and legitimacy of the Reform movement, so we begin to understand, right, why those who take over after him, why Rav Breuer and those who follow in the Breuer's community tend to move a little bit more towards that Aguda community, a little bit farther away from that world of synthesis, arguing for the primacy of Torah, arguing for distancing of ourselves from other elements of the Jewish community. And at the same time, we understand now how there was another story happening, unfolding in Germany at the same time. The story of Rashiel Hildesheimer, and a story that will ultimately take and create a rabbinical seminary that takes the blending of these two worlds quite seriously, and that his institution that he created will ultimately be given over to Yechiel Yaakov Weinberg, who will become into direct contact with Yosef B. Soloveitchik, who will ultimately bring those ideas to the other side of Washington Heights, to Yeshiva University. So we've seen then the story of modern Judaism unfold during this period, 1818 to 1885. The one story we didn't tell from this part of the world in this time was the start of conservative Judaism, which we could have given a lecture to, we didn't, but it ultimately happens right here, after the first rabbinical conferences, Reform rabbinical conferences, when these Reform rabbis get together to decide what it means to be part of this Reform community. There were those rabbis who had attended that conference who felt like the changes were too drastic. They were going too far, they were too radical, and so they wanted to create something more conservative. Small c, conservative, than what the Reform communities were. They didn't call themselves conservative at the time. That's a later name, but that's ultimately how they came to be. So indeed, much of what we know about modern Judaism came from this story, from these three stories that we told over the past 3 weeks. Before I end it, I think it's critical not to make the mistake that so many historians, Jewish historians, will make in calling this the sum total of the story of modern Judaism, because the truth of the matter is, and this is a little bit hard to see, right? But in this time period that we're talking about, and this is from 1880, there were about 500,000 Jews in Germany. 500,000 Jews. There were over 1 million Jews in Poland, and over 2.5 million Jews in Russia. So Germany is a small blip in the world of the Jewish landscape at the time. And to make the mistake of saying that all of modern Judaism happens here without paying any attention to what is happening here, that would be a mistake. And that would skew our vision and our view of what Judaism was and what it ultimately came to be. Of course, these require a separate set of lectures. I hope you'll invite me back to tell those as well.
Can I tell you a funny story?
Yeah.
Two generations later.
I don't know the names. These are Arabic names. Just that something. Robert Goldberg gave last night one about Rabbi Osher. How these rabbis are being because of the whatever was happening around the movement. And they wrote all these books inspired up computers. Good to see you.
Which was funny because your parents weren't even part of any of Roy's family. So you're getting married and like the husband. But on the other hand, thinking about this, what's really remarkable, I was just thinking about your parents when I was lecturing, is that people came out of the show. They didn't go back to their parents. Your parents adapted to
Right. Right. You're not gonna be there Tuesday.
But that was just the dialogue, they still lived in your life. They're letting you with Yeah.
Very good.
It was excellent, so what's your next series?
I know.
So wasn't it that Ross Soloveitchik made
Yes, that's right. Just to mention both of them.
And there was a third member of the Troika.
Who?
And my father was unbelievable.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, my son learned the verb first. Well, it was physical.
Yeah, no.
So my uncle told me, says,
Maybe the next one was Israel. Okay, that's next. Good night.
Good night.